Hello and welcome back to David Hume's History of England, and his chapter on Edward I continued. The Homage of Scotland. The temptation was too strong for the virtue of the English monarch to resist. He purposed to lay hold of the present favourable opportunity, and if not to create, at least to revive his claim of a feudal superiority over Scotland, a claim which had hitherto lain in the deepest obscurity, and which, if ever it had been an object of attention, or had been so much as suspected, would have effectively prevented the Scottish barons from choosing him for an umpire. He well knew that if this pretension were once submitted to, as it seemed difficult, in the present situation of Scotland, to oppose it, the absolute sovereignty of that kingdom, which had been the case with Wales, would soon follow, and that one great vassal, cooped up in an island with his liege lord, without resource from foreign powers, without aid from any fellow vassals, could not long maintain his dominions against the efforts of a mighty kingdom, assisted by all the cavils which the feudal law afforded his superior against him. In pursuit of this great object, very advantageous to England, perhaps in the end no less beneficial to Scotland, but extremely unjust and iniquitous in itself, Edward busied himself in searching for proofs of his pretended superiority, and instead of looking into his own archives, which, if his claim had been real, must have afforded him numerous records of the homages done by Scottish princes, and could alone yield him any authentic testimony, he made all the monasteries be ransacked for old chronicles and histories written by Englishmen, and he collected all the passages which seemed anywise to favour his pretensions. Yet even in this method of proceeding, which must have discovered to himself the injustice of his claim, he was far from being fortunate. He began his proofs from the time of Edward the Elder, and continued them through all the subsequent Saxon and Norman times, but produced nothing to this purpose. The whole amount of his authorities during the Saxon period, when stripped of the bombast and inaccurate style of the monkish historians, is that the Scots had sometimes been defeated by the English, and received peace on disadvantageous terms, and made submissions to the English monarch, and even perhaps fallen into some dependence on a power which was so much superior, and which they had not at that time sufficient force to resist. His authorities from the Norman period were, if possible, still less conclusive. The historians indeed made frequent mention of homage done by the Norman potentate, but no one of them says that it was done for his kingdom, and several of them declare, in express terms, that it was relative only to the fiefs which he enjoyed south of the Tweed. In the same manner as the King of England himself swore fealty to the French monarch for the fiefs which he inherited in France. And to such scandalous shifts was Edward reduced, that he quotes a passage from Hoveden, where it is asserted that a Scottish king had done homage to England, but he purposely omits the latter part of that sentence, which expresses that this prince did homage for the lands which he held in England. When William, King of Scotland, was taken prisoner in the Battle of Alnwick, he was obliged, for the recovery of his liberty, to swear fealty to the victor for his crown itself. The deed was performed according to all the rites of feudal law. The record was preserved in the English archives, and is mentioned by all the historians. But as it is the only one of the kind, and as historians speak of this superiority as a great acquisition gained by the fortunate arms of Henry II, there can remain no doubt that the kingdom of Scotland was, in all former periods, entirely free and independent. Its subjection continued a very few years. King Richard, desirous, before his departure from the Holy Land, to conciliate the friendship of William, renounced that homage, which, he says, in express terms, had been extorted by his father, and he only retained the usual homages which had been done by the Scottish princes for the lands which they held in England. But though this transaction rendered the independence of Scotland still more unquestionable than if no fealty had ever been sworn to the English crown, the Scottish kings, apprised of the point aimed at by their powerful neighbours, seem for a long time to have retained some jealousy on that head, and in doing homage to have anxiously obviated all such pretensions. When William, in 1200, did homage to John at Lincoln, he was careful to insert a salvo for his royal dignity. when Alexander III sent assistance to his father-in-law, Henry III, during the Wars of the Barons, he previously procured an acknowledgment that this aid was granted only from friendship, not from any right claimed by the English monarch. And when the same prince was invited to assist at the coronation of this very Edward, he declined attendance till he received a like acknowledgment. But all these reasons, and stronger could not be produced, were but a feeble rampart against the power of the sword. Edward, carrying with him a great army, which was to enforce his proofs, advanced to the frontiers and invited the Scottish Parliament and all the competitors to attend him in the castle at Norham, a place situated on the southern banks of the Tweed, in order to determine that cause which had been referred to his arbitration. But though this deference seemed due to so great a monarch, and was no more than what his father and the English barons had, in similar circumstances, paid to Louis IX, the king, careful not to give umbrage, and determined nevertheless to produce his claim till it should be too late to think of opposition, sent the Scottish barons an acknowledgment that, though at that time they passed the frontiers, this step should never be drawn into precedent, or afford the English kings a pretence for exacting a like submission in any future transaction. When the whole Scottish nation had thus unwarily put themselves into his power, Edward opened a conference at Norham, 10th of May. He informed the Parliament, by the mouth of Roger le Barbacon, his chief justiciary, that he was come thither to determine the right among the competitors to the crown, that he was determined to do strict justice to all parties, and that he was entitled to this authority, not in virtue of the reference made to him, but in quality of superior and liege lord of the kingdom. He then produced his proofs of this superiority, which he pretended to be unquestionable, and he required of them an acknowledgment of it, a demand which was superfluous if the fact were already known and avowed, and which plainly betrays Edward's consciousness of his lame and defective title. The Scottish Parliament was astonished at so new a pretension, and answered only by their silence. But the king, in order to maintain the appearance of a free and regular proceeding, desired them to remove into their own country, to deliberate upon his claim, to examine his proofs, to purpose all their objections, and to inform him of their resolution. And he appointed a plain at Upplesetton, on the northern banks of the Tweed, for that purpose. When the Scottish barons assembled in this place, though moved with indignation at the injustice of this unexpected claim, and at the fraud with which it had been conducted, they found themselves betrayed into a situation in which it was impossible for them to make any defence for their ancient liberty and independence for their country. The King of England, a martial and politic prince, at the head of a powerful army, lay at a very small distance, and was only separated from them by a river fordable in many places. Though by a sudden flight some of them might themselves be able to make their escape, what hopes could they entertain of securing the kingdom against his future enterprises? Without a head, without union amongst themselves, attached all them to different competitors, whose title they had rashly submitted to the decision of this foreign usurper, and who were thereby reduced to an absolute dependence upon him, they could only expect by resistance to entail on themselves and their posterity a more grievous and a more destructive servitude. Yet even in this desperate state of affairs, the Scottish barons, as we learn from Walsingham, one of the best historians of that period, had the courage to reply that, till they had a king, they could make no resolution on so momentous a point. The journal of King Edward says that they made no answer at all. It is perhaps no particular answer or objection to Edward's claim, and by this solution it is possible to reconcile the journal with the historian. The king, therefore, interpreting their silence as consent, addressed himself to the several competitors, and previously to his pronouncing sentence, required their acknowledgment of his superiority. It is evident from the genealogy of the royal family of Scotland that there could only be two questions about the succession, that between Balliol and Bruce on the one hand, and Lord Hastings on the other, concerning the partition of the crown, and that between Balliol and Bruce themselves, concerning the preference of their respective titles, supposing the kingdom indivisible. Yet there appeared on this occasion no less than 9 claimants besides: John Comyn, or Cummin, Lord Badenoch, Florence, Earl of Holland, Patrick Dunbar, Earl of March, William of Vasky, Robert de Pinkenny, Nicholas de Soles, Patrick Galithi, Roger de Mandeville, Robert de Ross, not to mention the King of Norway, who claimed as heir to his daughter Margaret. Some of these competitors were descended from more remote branches of the royal family. Others were even sprung from illegitimate children, and as none of them had the pretence of right, it is natural to conjecture that Edward had secretly encouraged them to appear in the list of claimants, that he might sow the more division among the Scottish nobility, make the cause appear the more intricate, and be able to choose, among a great number, the most obsequious candidate. But he found them all equally obsequious on this occasion. Robert Bruce was the first to acknowledge Edward's right of superiority over Scotland, and he had so far foreseen the king's pretensions, that even in his petition, where he set forth his claim to the crown, he had previously applied to him as liege lord of the kingdom, a step which was not taken by any of the other competitors. They all, however, with seeming willingness, made a like acknowledgment when required, though Balliol, lest he should give offence to the Scottish nation, had taken care to be absent during the first days, and he was the last that recognised the king's title. Edward next deliberated concerning the method of proceeding in the discussion of this great controversy. He gave orders that Balliol, and such of the competitors as adhered to him, should choose 40 commissioners, Bruce and his adherents 40 more. To these the king added 24 Englishmen. He ordered these 104 commissioners to examine the cause deliberately among themselves, and make their report to him, and he promised in the ensuing year to give his determination. Meanwhile, he pretended that it was requisite to have all the fortresses of Scotland delivered into his hands, in order to enable him, without opposition, to put the true heir in possession of the crown. And this exorbitant demand was complied with both by the states and by the claimants. The governors also of all the castles immediately resigned their command, except Umfraville, Earl of Angus, who refused, without a formal and particular acquittal from the Parliament and the several claimants, to surrender his fortress to so domineering an arbiter, who had given to Scotland so many just reasons of suspicion. Before this assembly broke up, which had fixed such a mark of dishonour on the nation, all the prelates and barons there present swore fealty to Edward, and that prince appointed commissioners to receive a like oath from all the other barons and persons of distinction in Scotland. The king, having finally made, as he imagined, this important acquisition, left the commissioners to sit at Berwick and examine the titles of the several competitors who claimed the precarious crown, which Edward was willing for some time to allow the awful heir to enjoy. He went southwards, both in order to assist at the funeral of his mother, Queen Eleanor, who died about this time, and to compose some differences which had arisen among the principal nobility. Gilbert, Earl of Gloucester, the greatest baron of the kingdom, had espoused the king's daughter, and being elated by that alliance, and still more by his own power, which he thought set him above the laws, he permitted his bailiffs and vassals to commit violence on the lands of Humphrey Bourne, Earl of Hereford, who retaliated the injury by like violence. But this was not a reign in which such illegal proceedings could pass with impunity. Edward procured a sentence against the 2 earls, committed them both to prison, and would not restore them to liberty till he had exacted a fine of 1,000 marks from Hereford, and one of 10,000 from his son-in-law. 1202. During this interval, the titles of John Balliol and of Robert Bruce, whose claims appeared to be the best founded amongst the competitors for the crown of Scotland, were the subject of general disquisition, as well as of debate among the commissioners. Edward, in order to give greater authority to his intended decision, proposed this general question, both to the commissioners and to the celebrated lawyers in Europe: whether a person descended from the eldest sister, but further removed by 1 degree, were preferable in succession of kingdoms, fiefs, and other indivisible inheritances, to one descended from the younger sister, but 1 degree nearer to the common stock. This was the true state of the case, and the principle of representation had now gained such ground everywhere that a uniform answer had returned to the king in the affirmative. He therefore pronounced sentence in the favour of Balliol, and when Bruce, upon this disappointment, joined afterwards Lord Hastings, and claimed a third of the kingdom, which he now pretended to be divisible, Edward, though his interest seemed more to require the partition of Scotland, again pronounced sentence in favour of Balliol. That competitor, upon renewing his oath of fealty to England, was put in possession of the kingdom. All his fortresses were restored to him, and the conduct of Edward, both in the deliberate solemnity of the proceedings and in the justice of the award, was so far unexceptional. 1293. Had the kingdom entertained no other view than that of establishing his superiority over Scotland, though the iniquity of that claim was apparent, and was aggravating by the most egregious breach of trust, he might have fixed his pretensions, and have left that important acquisition to his posterity. But he immediately proceeded in such a manner as made it evident that, not content with this usurpation, he aimed also at the absolute sovereignty and dominion of the kingdom. Instead of gradually inuring the Scots to the yoke, and exerting his rights of superiority with moderation, he encouraged all appeals to England, required King John himself, by 6 different summons on trivial occasions, to come to London, refused him the privileges of defending his cause by a procurator, and obliged him to appear at the bar of his Parliament as a private person. These humiliating demands were hitherto quite unknown to a King of Scotland. They are, however, the necessary consequence of vassalage by feudal law, and as there was no preceding instance of such treatment submitted to by a prince of that country, Edward must, from that circumstance alone, had there remained any doubt, have been himself convinced that his claim was altogether a usurpation. But this intention plainly was, to enrage Balliol by these indignities, to enrage him in rebellion, and to assume the dominion of the state as a punishment of his treason and felony. Accordingly, Balliol, though a prince of a soft and gentle spirit, returned into Scotland highly provoked at this usage, and determined at all hazards to vindicate his liberty. And the war which soon after broke out between France and England gave him a favourable opportunity of executing his purpose. The war with France. The violence, robberies, and disorders to which that age was so subject was not confined to the licentious barons and their retainers at land. The sea was equally infested with piracy. The feeble execution of the laws had given license to all orders of men, and a general appetite for rapine and revenge, supported by a false point of honour, had also infected the merchants and mariners, and had pushed them, on any provocation, to seek redress by immediate retaliation upon the aggressors. A Norman and an English vessel met off the coast near Bayonne, and both of them having occasion for water, they sent their boats to the land, and the several crews came at the same time to the same spring. There ensued a quarrel for the preference. A Norman, drawing his dagger, attempted to stab an Englishman, who, grappling with him, threw his adversary on the ground, and the Norman, as was pretended, falling on his own dagger, was slain. This scuffle between 2 seamen about water soon kindled a bloody war between 2 nations, and involved a great part of Europe in the quarrel. The mariners of the Norman ship carried their complaints to the French king, Philip, without inquiring into the fact, without demanding redress, bade them take revenge, and trouble him no more about the matter. The Normans, who had been more regular than usual in applying to the crown, needed but this hint to proceed to immediate violence. They seized an English ship in the Channel, and hanging, along with some dogs, several of the crew on the yardarm, in presence of their companions, dismissed the vessel, and bade the mariners inform their countrymen that vengeance was now taken for the blood of the Norman killed at Bayonne. This injury, accompanied with so general and deliberate an insult, was resented by the mariners of the King's ports, who, without carrying any complaint to the king, or waiting for redress, retaliated by committing like barbarities on all French vessels without distinction. The French, provoked by their losses, preyed on the ships of all of Edward's subjects, whether English or Gascon. The sea became a scene of piracy between the nations. The sovereigns, without either seconding or repressing the violence of their subjects, seemed to remain indifferent spectators. The English made private associations with the Irish and Dutch seamen, the French with Flemish and Genoese, and the animosities of the people on both sides became every day more violent and barbarous. A fleet of 200 Norman vessels set sail to the south for wine and other commodities, and in their passage seized all the English ships which they met with, hanged the seamen, and seized the goods. The inhabitants of the English seaports, informed of this incident, fitted out a fleet of 60 sail, stronger and better manned than the others, and awaited the enemy on their return. After an obstinate battle, they put them to the rout, and sunk, destroyed, or took the greater part of them. No quarter was given, and it was pretended that the loss of the French amounted to 15,000 men, which is accounted for by this circumstance, that the Norman fleet was employed in transporting a considerable body of soldiers from the south. The affair was now become too important to be any longer overlooked by the sovereigns. On Philip sending an envoy to demand reparation and restitution, the king dispatched the Bishop of London to the French court in order to accommodate the quarrel. He first said that the English courts of justice were open to all men, and if any Frenchman were injured, he might seek reparation by course of law. He next offered to adjust the matter by private arbiters, or by a personal interview with the King of France, or by a reference either to the Pope or to the College of Cardinals, or any particular cardinals agreed on by both parties. The French, probably the more disgusted as they were hitherto losers in the quarrel, refused all these expedients. The vessels and the goods of the merchants were confiscated on both sides. Depredations were continued by the Gascons on the western coast of France, as well as by the English in the Channel. Philip cited the king as Duke of Guienne to appear in his court at Paris and answer for these offences, and Edward, apprehensive of danger to that province, sent John St. John, an experienced soldier, to Bordeaux, and gave him directions to put Guienne in a posture of defence. 1294. That he might, however, prevent a final rupture between the nations, the king dispatched his brother, Edmund, Earl of Lancaster, to Paris. And as this prince had espoused the Queen of Navarre, mother to Jane, the Queen of France, he seemed, of account of that alliance, the most proper person for finding expedients to accommodate the difference. Jane pretended to interpose with her good offices. Mary, the Queen Dowager, feigned the same amicable disposition, and these two princes told Edmund that the circumstance the most difficult to adjust was the point of honour with Philip, who thought himself affronted by the injuries committed against him by his sub-vassals in Guienne. But if Edward would once consent to give him Sison in possession of that province, he would think his honour fully repaired, would engage to restore Guienne immediately, and would accept of a very easy satisfaction for all other injuries. The king was consulted on the occasion, and as he then found himself in immediate danger of war with the Scots, which he regarded as the more important concern, this politic prince, blinded by his favourite passion for subduing that nation, allowed himself to be deceived by so gross an artifice. He sent his brother's orders to sign and execute the treaty with the two queens. Philip solemnly promised to execute his part of it, and the king's citation to appear in the court of France was accordingly recalled. But the French monarch was no sooner put in possession of Guienne than the citation was renewed. Edward was condemned for non-appearance, and Guienne, by a formal sentence, was declared to be forfeited and annexed to the crown. Edward, fallen into a like snare with that which he himself had prepared for the Scots, was enraged, and the more so, as he was justly ashamed of his own conduct in being so egregiously overreached by the court of France. Sensible of the extreme difficulties which he should encounter in the recovery of Gascony, where he had not retained a single place in his hands, he endeavoured to compensate that loss by forming alliances with several princes, who he projected should attack France in all quarters, and make a diversion of her forces. Alphonsus de Nassau, king of the Romans, entered into a treaty with him for that purpose, as did also Amadeus, Count of Savoy, the Archbishop of Cologne, the Counts of Gouldre and Luxembourg, the Duke of Brabant, and Count of Bar, who had married his two daughters, Margaret and Eleanor. But these alliances were extremely burdensome to his narrow revenues, and proved in the issue entirely ineffectual. More impression was made on Guienne by an English army, which he completed by emptying the jails of many thousand thieves and robbers who had been confined there for their crimes. So low had the profession of arms fallen, and so much had it degenerated from the estimation in which it stood during the vigour of the feudal system. 1295. The king himself was detained in England, first by contrary winds, then by his apprehension of a Scottish invasion, and by a rebellion of the Welsh, whom he repressed and brought again under subjection. The army which he sent to Guienne was commanded by his nephew, John de Bretagne, Earl of Richmond, and under him by St. John, Tibetot, de Vere, and other officers of reputation, who made themselves masters of the town of Bayonne, as well as of Bourg, Blaye, Riol, Saint-Sever, and other places, which straitened Bordeaux, and cut off its communication both by sea and land. The favour which the Gascon nobility bore to the English government facilitated these conquests, and seemed to promise still greater successes. But this advantage was soon lost by the misconduct of some of the officers. Philip's brother, Charles de Valois, who commanded the French armies, having laid siege to Podensac, a small fortress near Riol, obliged Clifford, the governor, to capitulate. And these articles, though favourable to the English, left all the Gascons prisoners at discretion, of whom above 50 were hanged by Charles's rebels, a policy by which he both intimidated that people and produced an irreparable breach between them and the English. That prince immediately attacked Rieux, where the Earl of Richmond himself commanded, and as the place seemed not tenable, the English general drew his troops to the waterside with an intention to embarking with the greater part of the army. The enraged Gascons fell upon his rear, and at the same time opened their gates to the French, who, besides making themselves masters of the place, took many prisoners of distinction. Saint-Sever was more vigorously defended by Hugh de Vere, son of the Earl of Oxford, but was at last obliged to capitulate. The French king, not content with these successes in Gascony, threatened England with an invasion, and by a sudden attempt his troops took and burnt Dover, but were obliged soon after to retire. And in order to make a greater diversion of the English force, and engage Edward in dangerous and important wars, he formed a secret alliance with John Balliol, King of Scotland, the commencement of that strict union, which during so many centuries was maintained by mutual interests and necessities between the French and Scottish nations. John confirmed this alliance by stipulating a marriage between his eldest son and the daughter of Charles de Valois. Thank you for listening. I know it's not a particularly long episode, but, we'll continue on the next one. Thank you.